I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar entitled Navigating the Voluntary Withdrawal of OCALIVA, Obeticholic Acid for PBC. The webinar is supported by an educational grant from Intercept Pharmaceuticals, and I'd like to thank them for the support. I'm fortunate to be joined by a very, very trusted colleague tonight, Aparna Goel. Aparna, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Aparna. I'm one of the hepatologists at Stanford University out in California, in Palo Alto. I have a clinical research interest in PBC, so I hope that we can give you some information today that's helpful for your patients.
And I didn't introduce myself. I'm Dr. Stephen Flamm, a transplant hepatologist and the director of clinical research at Rush University in Chicago. And I, like Dr. Goel, have had many patients with PBC who have required second-line therapy. And that's why they've asked us tonight to talk to you about the voluntary withdrawal of OCALIVA. I'm going to start and talk to you a little bit about the background, just so you can understand some of the underpinnings of this. The core rationale, why was there a withdrawal? First of all, the withdrawal of OCALIVA was not forced upon us. This was a voluntary withdrawal from the United States by Intercept. And the FDA did submit a withdrawal request to Intercept for this drug, but it wasn't mandated. Why? Why did they do it? Well, first of all, there was a long-term trial on OCALIVA named the COBALT trial. And this COBALT clinical trial, which was primarily designed to assess efficacy and safety of long-term usage of obeticholic acid, failed to demonstrate that obeticholic acid improved liver-related outcomes compared to placebo in the randomized controlled trial cohort. This was a randomized controlled trial. In December of last year, almost 1 year ago, the drug safety communication that was issued to Intercept by FDA also identified cases of serious liver injury among patients that were treated for PBC with OCALIVA who did not have cirrhosis of the liver. And both of these things led to the reevaluation of the drug's risk-benefit profile and subsequent FDA removal requests. Now, what data did the FDA highlight to tilt the risk-benefit analysis and request the withdrawal? Again, what I just mentioned, that the FDA's request was based on their reevaluation of the drug's risk-benefit profile. And it was, again, from this letter issued, which they call a drug safety communication. And it was based on data that the FDA had reviewed. Now, the voluntary withdrawal by Intercept was instituted in September of 2025. And it is this culmination of this regulatory review. It is important for all of you, healthcare providers who care for patients with PBC and may have patients on OCALIVA, that there were no new acute safety signals that emerged in the patient population since December 2024, when this initial request by FDA was made of Intercept. So nothing new has happened since then. Now, one of the questions we get from providers when we discuss this withdrawal is, how significant was the increased risk in the DSC, this communication reported from this non-cirrhotic cohort? Now, among non-cirrhotic patients receiving OCA, the risk of both liver transplant and death was higher compared with those receiving placebo, and the hazard ratio was 4.77. And when they looked at the data and the patient numbers involved, this did reach statistical significance. And these again were injuries in patients without cirrhosis. But it is critical to note that the statistical significance was driven by a very small number of events, 7 in the OCA arm versus 1 in the placebo arm. And because of that, it widens the confidence interval and suggests, in a statistical terminology, instability in the risk estimate, meaning it's not sure, there really weren't enough events to have a solid confirmation of this finding. And furthermore, the small number of events and then just the nature of post-marketing data introduce confounding factors that even question the validity of the assessment. But the assessment is what the assessment is, and FDA thus issued that request to Intercept late last year to withdraw the product. And they did so because they again thought that the risk-benefit ratio was not favorable for the population based on its indication from this evidence. So, the current clinical imperative, the imperative for you, what is the timeline for the transition from people being on OCALIVA to any new choice you may make for second-line therapy, which Aparna is going to discuss with you in a couple of minutes? And should we mandate immediate discontinuation for all current patients? It's important to note that OCALIVA will no longer be commercially available in the United States after November the 14th, 2025. So as we're recording this, OCALIVA is still available for a couple of more weeks. But if people are reviewing this later, OCALIVA won't be available anymore. And of course, you will have to transition your patients. Patients currently taking OCALIVA should not discontinue therapy without consulting with their healthcare provider, of course. They shouldn't rush to discontinue it without advice from you. Now, as far as discontinuation and pharmacological management, what is the background? There has been a 60-day window between when OCALIVA was voluntarily withdrawn by Intercept and when the product will no longer be available in mid-November of 2025. Now, that again is approaching as we record this session. But, of course, you do not initiate new patients on OCALIVA. Also, you try in your practice to identify current patients on OCALIVA and a plan for transition to another drug. And thirdly, you transition appropriate patients to another second-line therapy within this time period. Again, you will now have to do this by November the 14th, 2025. Now, how do you do it? Patients, providers, they want to know, how do you do it? How do you discontinue it? Do you have to taper the drug, or can you just abruptly stop it? Are there risks? Are there withdrawal issues from stopping OCALIVA? And the answer is OCALIVA can be discontinued without tapering the dose. Obeticholic acid is an FXR, a farnesoid X receptor agonist, and it does not have any known physiological dependence, nor does it have any acute rebound effects. And there have been no reports of classic withdrawal syndrome with withdrawal of this drug in the clinical literature, nor have there been any in my own personal practice. And Dr. Goel can comment on that as well in a minute when she takes over. Now, what about pharmacokinetics and washout period? Now, what is the pharmacokinetic profile? And do you need a washout period before you start a new second-line agent? It turns out that the half-life for obeticholic acid and its metabolites is approximately 4 days, which means that a post-treatment washout period of all of this lasts for about 2 weeks. And despite that, there is no need for a tapering of the dose or waiting for this 2-week period prior to starting another second-line agent if you think that's indicated. What would be a risk, though, in a gap of therapy? What would be the risk of you stopping the medicine and then waiting for months on end to try to get a second-line therapeutic agent if you thought one was necessary? Is there a loss of therapeutic benefit? Well, discontinuation of OCA followed by a gap could result in loss of biochemical benefit. And if the biochemical benefit is lost, then this could theoretically lead to a return to a higher risk disease trajectory for patients who do require second-line therapy. So a gap, certainly any sizable gap, is not ideal for patients who do need second-line therapy. And without initiation of this another second-line therapy, if you wondered how long does it take for these abnormal biochemical profile numbers to recur, it's within a few months, we think, of discontinuation. What about symptom changes? Are there symptom changes? When patients are stopping OCALIVA, do they all of a sudden feel worse or do they feel better? How do we counsel them, particularly in regards to pruritus? Well, pruritus, which of course is the most common side effect of OCALIVA in clinical trials and a common symptom of many patients with PBC to begin with, did in fact typically improve over time or after discontinuation of the product. This has been known in the past. And we expect pruritus to improve after stopping OCA. We don't think it's going to worsen. And there are no data on worsening of fatigue or quality of life, two other major factors in many patients with PBC, after you discontinue OCALIVA. So at this point, I'm going to hand this speaker platform over to Dr. Goel, who's going to discuss with you how do you monitor patients that are transitioning and more about alternative therapies. Aparna?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Flamm. That was a lovely overview of the rationale for why obeticholic acid was discontinued. So I'll get into a little bit of the nitty gritty and just more practical recommendations here for how to monitor patients while you're taking them off of obeticholic acid and what other therapies to consider. All right. So what should you do once a patient has discontinued obeticholic acid? Just a reminder that in PBC, alkaline phosphatase and bilirubin are considered acceptable surrogate markers for disease outcomes. So elevated alkaline phosphatase levels, elevated bilirubin levels tend to indicate a worse prognosis and potentially higher risk of liver-related events. So we are looking at those numbers when you're discontinuing obeticholic acid in the patients. It's important to know that whenever you're discontinuing therapy or swapping therapy, you are likely going to be monitoring your patients more and be checking your laboratories a little bit more frequently. So as Dr. Flamm mentioned, once obeticholic acid is discontinued, there's likely to be a worsening of both the alkaline phosphatase and potentially the bilirubin. And we tend to see that within weeks to months. It's recommended that in order to sort of monitor for that change in laboratory biochemistries, to repeat the liver test about 12 weeks, within 12 weeks or so after discontinuing obeticholic acid, and then every 3 to 6 months after that. It is very possible that you're going to be starting another second-line therapy in this interim, and will need to have your frequent monitoring regardless to understand what the response is to your other second-line agent that you choose. So what about imaging and monitoring? What about other symptoms? So as Dr. Flamm mentioned, it's important to monitor for pruritus. Usually that improves in patients that discontinue obeticholic acid. There really haven't been any signs of worsening fatigue or liver decompensation within a short window after a patient discontinues obeticholic acid, but it is important to monitor for that. So we're always monitoring for signs of hepatic decompensation, including jaundice, ascites, and encephalopathy. There is no recommendation right now for immediate imaging. So you don't necessarily have to pursue an ultrasound or cross-sectional imaging immediately after stopping obeticholic acid. if you have a patient with cirrhosis that needs HCC screening or HCC surveillance regardless, then you're going to continue on those regularly scheduled intervals. So every 6 months screening with cross-sectional imaging or ultrasounds. And it is recommended to do some fibrosis assessments with either transient elastography or other non-invasive measures of fibrosis routinely. But there isn't an immediate need to pursue imaging or immediate need to pursue repeat assessment of fibrosis markers just because obeticholic acid has been discontinued. You continue the same practice that you otherwise would have for that patient that's in front of you. So, what are the other second line agents that we're considering? There are two second line therapies that are available and FDA approved for people that do not have an adequate response to ursodiol or do not tolerate it. The approved therapies are elafibranor and seladelpar. Both of these were approved in the summer of last year. We do encourage all patients that are currently on obeticholic acid to contact their providers and discuss what the next therapy plan should be once obeticholic acid is discontinued. So just remember that there is a different mechanism of action of these two other agents compared to obeticholic acid. As Dr. Flamm mentioned, obeticholic acid is a farnesoid X receptor agonist and FXR agonist. Seladelpar and elafibranor are a different class of drugs known as PPAR agonists. So elafibranor is a dual peroxisome proliferator activator receptor agonist that works on both the alpha and the delta isoforms. And seladelpar is a selective PPAR delta agonist. So slight different in terms of mechanisms, but relatively very similar in that they're both considered PPARs. One second. So once you start therapy, do you need to overlap treatment and what about interaction? So um, just to reiterate, you do not need to overlap or bridge therapy. So when you don't have to start a PPAR agonist before you discontinue obeticholic acid. You don't need to have a bridging period where both of them are given together. So it is okay to have a gap of second line therapy and have obeticholic acid be discontinued and then start your second line therapy after that, your new second line therapy after that. If you do choose to overlap for whatever reason, there are not any anticipated drug-drug interactions between elafibranor and obeticholic acid or seladelpar and obeticholic acid. And just remember, it's important to speak with your patients to determine the timelines of starting your next second line agents and to determine what the next step in distinguishing between the two PPARs for what therapy might be more appropriate for them. All right. So we'll talk briefly about safety and access. So for patients that are currently on obeticholic acid, and if they're tolerating it well, is there any acute safety concern if they remain on the drug until their next scheduled appointment? The answer is no. There is no immediate new safety concern. This is, again, sort of the FDA's reevaluation of the risk benefit profile that was communicated over a year ago now. So there's no new safety information that we have learned in the past year. It is not due to any other additional safety signals in the current population that we had. And in your patients that are on obeticholic acid that have been monitored very closely and whose labs have been normal or stable, whose fibrosis stage has remained normal or stable during the course of their treatment with obeticholic acid, we do not think that they have suffered harm from being on the therapy, and they should proceed to transition to an alternative second line agent, like we mentioned earlier. So, monitoring for adverse events, once we switch to a new second line agent, as with all medication changes for really any disease state, it is important to monitor for adverse events. And it's just good common practice to do that. So, yes, absolutely be monitoring for any new safety signals. If you do have a suspected adverse reaction, it's important to report that and to consider transitioning to an alternative therapy and discontinuing therapy. And how will insurance and coverage handle this change? And what can we tell patients about access to new drugs? So, with the withdrawal of obeticholic acid, insurers are unlikely to pay for obeticholic acid. It won't be available anymore, and they won't be paying for it anymore. It will be important for patients to work with providers and with insurers to understand what might be covered and what requires prior authorizations to obtain the appropriate approval for the planned medication. Providers can also direct patients with any concerns that they may have regarding access and insurance to interconnect patient support services. And these are the two contact numbers that might be helpful for both clinicians and patients to have. So, Intercept medical information phone number is listed here, and then the patient support service number is listed up here. All right. So, just to summarize what both Dr. Flamm and I have discussed today, reminder that obeticholic acid, the withdrawal of obeticholic acid, is due to the updated risk benefit assessment, not any acute new safety events. Obeticholic acid will not be available effective November 14th, so it's important to transition patients. There is no taper, there is no washout period that's required when you're starting a second line agent. It's important to monitor for loss of biochemical control. So, monitor for those changes in the alkaline phosphatase and the bilirubin, and understand that if a patient does potentially jump up in both of those laboratory values, that it does indicate that they may be at a higher risk disease trajectory again. And you want to mitigate that with initiation of another second line agent. All right. That was the end of the plan presentation. We're happy to open it up for any questions that you all may have now. Don't see anything in the chat.
I'll ask a question, Aparna, since no one else did. When you get asked from providers about this question, when they're discontinuing OCA, is there one choice of a second line therapeutic agent, since there's more than one choice that you have that you use? How do you address that with them?
Yeah. So it's really hard to understand if we don't know enough data about, head to head comparing Seladelpar to Elafibranor to understand which one is more effective. They both had very good efficacy in their respective phase 3 trials. There's a few nuances that are important to understand when you are selecting an appropriate second line agent. So, for example, and someone that might be planning to conceive, and someone that that it's important to potentially to not use Elafibranor to make sure that there's really good birth control. For patients that are on a concomitant statin, you also have to be pretty mindful with monitoring for CK and renal function. Same with Seladelpar. In both Seladelpar and Elafibranor, there were some signals about maybe we need to monitor bone health a little bit more carefully. But I think there's a lot to learn still about how to distinguish the two of them. The one thing that I will ask about is fatigue and pruritus. In the phase 3 study for Seladelpar, there was a significant improvement in patients that had moderate to severe pruritus at the entry of the trial. So if a patient does have significant pruritus, even after discontinuing obeticholic acid, that might be of particular interest, and potentially choosing that might be beneficial, just to both control the disease and also to control the symptom.
Absolutely right. So, the bottom line is providers have to learn about both of those new options. There's a very, very many similarities, but there are these nuances, and you have to determine there isn't one choice for everybody. You have to determine which patient would benefit from one versus the other, or that it doesn't actually matter for any patient.
Yeah.
Sometimes insurance, of course, mandates that. They
Right.
dictate what you
That's the
use.
other thing I was going to say. There are times where I might want to start something, but what's actually on the preferred formulary is something else. And there might not be a strong reason why they can't do what's on the formulary first. So,
Understand.
absolutely.
Exactly. Well, good. Well, I don't see any other questions. So we can call this webinar to a close. I'd like to thank everybody who participated, and good luck with caring for your patients with PBC. And fortunately, we have options for therapy now, other second-line agents that we can use in lieu of OCALIVA. So good luck with everybody, and have a nice rest of the week. Thank you, Dr. Goel, as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Flamm. Thanks, everyone.